So it's been, I mean, as you know, it's been kind of a crazy week. Just, all of a sudden you kind of have things. This may come as a shock to you. I'm not a detailed planner, right? But I do sketch things out. Like I kind of know where things are usually going. And so whenever you throw in that, okay, you're going to miss this Sunday, and then you already had a little vacation planned here, but the reason you're missing this Sunday is because of surgery, so you don't know how that's going to affect. And then you get that date set, and then they change it on you. It's been really fun. And and then I did a funeral, and it was one of those funerals that it ended up had to meet with the family. It wasn't from here; it was from somebody that I met with hospice, and really good family, but just needed a lot. And so had to go on Thursday night up to Georgetown, and then things kind of went a little haywire. So I needed to go Friday night to make sure everything was fine, and then it was Saturday morning, right? The service. It's just been one of those, right? And then I realized, I've scheduled people to cover other Sundays, but I still have to preach this Sunday, And I had an idea of where I was going, but I didn't get as far as I thought I would, and there was just a passage that just jumped out to me, and I'm gonna land there today, but I really think it's a wonderful summary, big picture summary of who God is and who we are and what God desires, right? And a good summary in Deuteronomy as well. So we're going to be in Deuteronomy chapter 23, and I'll just run you through my preparation time. I started reading Deuteronomy chapter 23, so I'm trying to figuring, okay, where are we going? How far am I going to skip ahead? Things like that. So it starts off. No one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord. That's an interesting way to start, right? No one born of a forbidden marriage, nor any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation, for they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt. Then they hired Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor, in Aram Naharim. I probably mispronounced every one of those, but it sounded like I knew what I was talking about, to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. Do not despise an Edomite, for the Edomites are related to you. Do not despise an Egyptian, for you resided as foreigners in their country. The third generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. Okay, let's stop right there. That last verse really jumped out to me. We'll get to exactly why. But I do want to hit kind of what's happening here, because it's kind of interesting. Again, Moses is talking to the people. He's telling them all of these things and how they're going to look moving forward, what's really important. And so he names a few things, and these were more specific to that group of people, what they were going through. But it says these groups don't need to be part of the assembly. It says the assembly of the Lord. Now, I started digging into that a little bit. It's like, okay, what is that talking about? Right? Which I think is important. Whenever you see something that doesn't sound right. Well, there's a couple of things. One, there's even within Hebrew scholars and even Jewish scholars, there's a little bit of debate as to what this means. One thing that is pretty clear is it doesn't mean that people can't come and be part of the people of Israel, right? It's not talking about that necessarily. Most actually think this would have been referred to, the assembly of the Lord would have been referred to leadership positions within the people, right? That now as they establish a new society, a new government, essentially, that there's some certain people that don't need to be part of that. It doesn't mean that they can't be part of the group, that they can't enter and be part of the Jewish people, but it does mean you've got to be careful who leads. Okay, so that is more than likely what that means, especially the very beginning. Those who emasculate themselves. Well, that's actually specifically referring, though that was a normal ritual that was done for people worshiping pagan gods. So what God is saying is, okay, those who were high up in worshiping pagan gods, you don't need to put them in leadership positions in the assembly of the Lord. Right? That kind of makes sense. Okay? Does that mean that they couldn't find forgiveness and become part of the Jewish people? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But it does mean that you're going to limit the position that they can be in. Right? And that is reaffirmed as it talks about the Ammonites and the Moabites. Okay, those groups of people, and if you remember, they tried to backstab the people whenever they had come out of Egypt, and they tried to curse them, and God didn't like that a whole lot. However, I think it's very important. There is a book in the Old Testament called Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. So does this passage mean that if you are from that group of people, you could have no association at all with the people? Obviously not. Right? Because guess who is in the line of Ruth and Boaz? That would be Jesus Christ, which is actually a beautiful picture. Right? Here's this group of people who was mistreated the people of God, but yet God still offers them forgiveness. Now, he didn't want them being in leadership positions of the new government. Understandable, right? But so I'm reading all of that, seeing that, and it continues on, and you get to the Edomites. Remember that they came from the line of Esau, right? And there was always a little bit of contention there. And but God says, do not despise them, even though you have your differences. Don't despise them. Right? They can be part of the kingdom or the assembly of the Lord. But then he says, do not despise an Egyptian, because you resided as foreigners in their country. The third generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. Now, why did that make me stop? The people that he's talking to, literally their parents and their grandparents, were beaten, had their children thrown into the Nile, were forced into hard labor by who? The Egyptians. Right? And God is telling the people, do not keep them out. Right? What is he saying? He's saying you cannot harbor bitterness towards them. Now, is he justifying anything they did? Obviously not. God punished the Egyptians. If you read what God did through that, they received punishment. Right? But now he's speaking to this people who would naturally have huge resentment towards the Egyptians. Right? I mean, it just obviously. And I'm sure some of them, because this is how I would think, you know what? If we become a strong enough nation and we gain power and prestige, you know who the first people we're going after are? It's the Egyptians. Why? Because they deserve it. And guess what? In our normal thinking, in our human thinking, they would deserve it. And you could actually make justification that they do. So why is it that God specifically told the people, don't harbor that against the Egyptians? Because God is a God of freedom, not a God of slavery. And I want to flesh this out a little bit, because there's different aspects to slavery. But at the heart of what slavery does, of being enslaved to something, right? And we're talking big picture here. Being enslaved to something, the first thing that it does is it denies you citizenship. It denies that you are equal. It denies you being part of the group. You are now stigmatized, right? It intentionally separates you out. It makes it to where people look at you as a different class of people. That is what it's designed to do, right? So whether the slavery comes along racial lines, which is the way that we immediately start seeing it, rightfully so. That's what our experience, dark history is in our country, right? But slavery has been around all over the world, not always based on a racial line, but it always separated people out, and it made them feel second, at least, right? Or less than. Right? Whenever people, if you were a slave in Rome, some of those slaves had very high positions and had, they had really good lives in many cases with some of them, but they were still not part of the group. They were still on the outside with no path to get on the inside, right? If you are enslaved, separated by slavery, if you are the ones that are enslaved, you have no path to become the unslaved, if that makes sense. Right? In our humanness and evil, that is what slavery is used for. But then slavery also, it's just used to kill, steal, and destroy. Which, what is that reflective of? Reflective of the spirit of the age. That is Satan, right? We talk about the world, and we've been talking about the world in this big picture of understanding the spiritual aspect of what is going on. And it is vital to understand that there is good and there is evil, right? There is God, and then there is trying to do things without God, which when you start trying to do things without God, eventually it devolves into doing things as the spirit of the age wants. And it'll mask it and it'll make it look okay, but eventually it devolves to the point that its goal is to kill, steal, and destroy. And the idea and the concept of slavery accomplishes that better than anything else. Because if you are enslaved, you feel like you cannot become part of the group. You are completely separated. And then it just begins to crush you spiritually, physically, mentally, all of it. God is a God who desires to free us from slavery. So why, in this case, why did he tell the people, don't hold that against the Egyptians? Because if they did, they would still be enslaved. Because they would still be enslaved by bitterness. They would still be enslaved by anger. And they may lash out, but it wouldn't bring healing. They would still be experiencing that, and God wanted them to be free of that, where they no longer were defined as being slaves from Egyptian slaves, but they were now defined as children of God. Right? You put that behind you. Doesn't mean you pretend it didn't exist. No. But you don't allow that to continue to control you now that you are free. See, there's different aspects to slavery. There's both physical slavery and there's spiritual slavery. Right? That it can keep us bound and keep us separated from God. That is what Satan desires, to keep us separated from God. And so he uses physical slavery in this world to accomplish that. Right? It is ugly. But he also uses spiritual slavery to enslave us to our sin, so that we become so controlled by our sin that we feel like there's no way that I can ever be good enough to be part of God's people. Look at who I am. And then there's even some of us who we finally get to that point to where we say, okay, I accept that God loves me. But we never forgive ourselves. We never put that stuff behind us. And so even though we have accepted in theory that God may forgive us, we are still enslaved because we cannot forgive ourselves. We cannot push that behind us. You see this all the time, right? And understandably so. We're talking about big things here, right? We're talking about people who were abused by their parents, right? There's two ways you can go from that. You can live your life basically in a horrible way, and you can always say, well, you know what? My parents, they treated me horribly and they abused me. They didn't teach me how to live. And you know what? That's why I'm sitting here in this jail cell and I'm the victim. And you know what? If my parents wouldn't have done this. And guess what? You'd be right in all of that. But you know what? God doesn't want you to live in slavery from what you unfairly experienced in the past. He wants to free you from that. And you say, yes, I lived horribly. My parents were horrible. They abused me. They didn't give me any chance at life. But God did, and He freed me. God is a God who wants to free us from our slavery. But the enemy is looking for any way he can to enslave us. And he will use any means necessary. And we see that around us all the time. I want to get pretty specific here in our practical examples. Here in this country, we know and we have experienced physical slavery, right? It's a huge part of our history. It was a huge part of all history at the time, but we've dealt with it in some ways very good, in some ways very bad, but it is now being used again, and it will always be used to cause chaos and sow division, because it did happen, right? And so there's natural bitterness towards what did happen, and especially in the Black community, right? The Black community has experienced more challenges than many in this country. Everybody has experienced challenges. The Black community has experienced unique challenges that are extremely unfair, and were evil, and were designed to be evil, right? And finally, we overcame some of that, and then it was a process, right? And it's continued. Well, now you've got to be very careful, because what I see now is there's kind of a encouragement to do the exact opposite of what this verse is talking about. There's an encouragement to actually, you know what, we still haven't paid and atoned for all of that, so we still need to harbor bitterness. Well, guess what that is doing? That is just enslaving people who rightfully should be embittered, but it is enslaving them again to a spirit of bitterness, right? And it is so frustrating because it hurts all of us. This is clearly coming not from God, right? And it is vital that we understand this. I want to get just a little bit, because you look at the teaching and the basic premise of Martin Luther King, right? It was like, we need to live up to what we have said, that all men are created equal, right? We need to judge by the content of character, not by the color of skin, right? And by the way, all of this is stupid if you just look at the basic biblical principle. The basic biblical principle is so simple that all are created in the image of God. He created them male and female. He didn't care what skin color they were. right? If you want to really get into it, you look at the science of it, and it depended on where you lived in the globe, how dark your skin was. Because God knew, if you're in the burning hot sun, it probably helps not to be pale white. Okay? Right? That's seriously where it gets down to. And by the way, the reason that we have a lot of this modern problem is because of the science. You do the research on eugenics and crap like that, go back to Darwin and you look at the descent of man, his theory, his scientific theory that we all embrace, our whole educational system embraces his garbage. It led to us believing that black people were inferior and were less than. Was the justification for modern science, okay? Of so much of the bigotry that we have seen. Right? And then all of a sudden we start to overcome all this, and then we have the civil rights movement, which was so needed to make it to where we actually in law treated everyone the same, right? But Satan wasn't done. He was horrified that Martin Luther King stood up and gave that wonderful speech, because he doesn't want anybody coming together, right? So we have the movement that starts to make things by law equal. But then we move a little bit further, and all of a sudden you have legislation that basically begins to enslave that same community to the government. Because look, we're going to give you all of this stuff, and we're going to make it to where now you need all of that to survive, because we're not going to provide a way for you to do it on your own. In fact, we're going to tell you, we are your saviors. Come to us and we will help you, rather than taking a biblical view and saying, you have experienced ridiculous persecution, you have gone through all kinds of stuff, but you can succeed, you can overcome. God desires for you to overcome. You can do it, and we will be here alongside of you. But we have seen how Satan works and enslaves, and now Martin Luther King would not be welcome in the modern activist movement of our racial narrative, because the modern racial narrative is not judged by the content of character, not by the color of skin. It is actually take into account the color of skin, elevate that. And in fact, past discrimination, this is a quote in Ibram X. Kendi's book, past discrimination requires present discrimination. Present discrimination requires future discrimination, right? That we have to continue to discriminate in order, that just creates a cycle of what? Of slavery. It just reverses, right? And that is what Satan desires. That is not what God desires. God does not want someone who is born into the black community to be told that, you know what, you live in a system that's going to give you no chance, and you have no chance to succeed at all. What does that do? It enslaves you again. God desires for us to break out of that, right? And our country has done better, and we may not like to hear this because all countries are sinful, but we have done more to overcome those barriers than any other country. But we don't want to talk about that, because if we do, we may actually come together, right? We talk about how Thomas Jefferson had slaves. We don't talk about why that was. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that he wrote the first, and you can see it, it exists. The first draft of the Declaration of Independence specifically said, we're freeing everybody. It's very simple, but basically he was like, this is what England is forcing us to keep doing this, and we're done with it. Guess what? 11 colonies voted for that, but they needed all 13. It was that close. Satan was terrified, but by 2 votes, the founding of our country kept the possibility of slavery. And so now we talk about Thomas Jefferson. Well, he still owned slaves. Why don't we talk about the nearly dozen of founders who were at the forefront of the abolition movement. Why don't we talk about all of the black Americans and the black patriots that fought side by side? In the Revolutionary War, the regiments were not segregated. Black and white fought side by side. Civil War, they were segregated because that sinfulness got in and just continued to manifest. Why don't we talk about that? Why don't we talk about the black preachers who preached on the floor of Congress in the late 1700s, early 1800s? Why don't we talk about the first black senator that was in the early 1830s? Why don't we talk about that stuff? Because Satan wants us divided. He wants us enslaved. He wants black people to feel like they are still oppressed in every way possible. He wants white people to be enslaved by their guilt. That's what he wants. God knew that that could happen to the people of Israel too. And he said, don't do it. I am a God who is a God that frees the captives. But see, it's more. It's more than physical slavery. It's also spiritual slavery. Satan wants us enslaved to our sin. And what do we see happening all around us in our society right now? No, don't talk about that. That may make someone feel bad. That'll hurt someone's feelings. Don't talk about that sinfulness, right? Because we don't want them to feel bad. What is that doing? That is allowing them to stay in that sin, which what does that do? It enslaves them and it separates them from the freeing love of Jesus Christ. It is insidious and it is ugly. And I've seen it in numerous ways. There's many examples that you could use. I know I have talked to people about, how do you handle the abortion issue in church? And so, Pastor, we talk about it, and I have heard the conversations. You know what? We just don't talk about it too much because, man, for those who have experienced, who have had an abortion, man, we just feel so bad for them, and it makes them feel bad when you talk about the ugliness of abortion and what it really is. And guess what? I understand that. But you know what? I care for that person. My heart breaks for that person who was deceived and encouraged by a godless society that was the best option for them. My heart breaks for them. And the only way that they are going to be able to step out of the slavery of those decisions is for them to recognize that was sinfulness. But I know the one who forgives sin. And now I have given my life to Christ. And even though I did this and I still feel those emotions of regret because we're human and we can't ever fully get rid of those emotions. I still feel those emotions of regret, but those emotions are fully overcome by the knowledge of the grace of Jesus Christ, that knowing I committed that sinfulness back then still forgives me and welcomes me into his open arms. That is healing. And if we don't talk about sin, people don't experience healing. How ridiculous is that whenever you step back and think about it? That the church, we are complicit in enslaving people to their sin because we don't have the guts to stand up and be a little uncomfortable and say, you know what? No, that is sinful. I'm sorry. Yes, you sinned. I sinned. But I know the one who frees us from that. And then moving forward to where it gets even more ugly. When we talk about it, and the church struggles with this, well, how do we address sexual sin? One, it's uncomfortable. We don't like talking about it. Strangely, it's all through Scripture, right? Strangely, it's like anytime there's a list of sins, it's the first one. Why is that? Because all of us are obsessed with it, right? And it's the huge, I've used this phrase before, it's the huge check engine light that whenever you start losing your sexual morals, it only goes downhill from there, right? And so what did we do as a church? We're like, okay, we're becoming very liberated here. And, there's lots of feminists and there's all these new ideas that say sex is just it's just pleasure. It's just fun. And men and women both experience it the same. And there shouldn't be any of these inhibitions. We need to free people from those. Whenever you kind of feel that guilt because you've gone too far with your girlfriend, we don't want you to feel that guilt. So, it starts off early on. It's like, I know God desires sex to be between a man and a woman and in the confines of marriage. But come on. I mean, now used to they got married when they were really young. Now we're waiting a bit. You really want people to wait to experience that pleasure and that goodness? And so, okay, so you know what? We're going to quit talking about the sex outside of marriage stuff. Okay, whew. We don't want to offend anyone. We'll keep talking about the other stuff. We're not going to talk about that one. Okay. Then all of a sudden, man, there's lots of people getting divorced. Maybe it's because they slept around with a bunch of people, and now that they're expected to sleep with only one person, they're like, well, this is kind of hard. Right? And so adultery goes up, divorce goes up, and then it's like, well, we can't really talk about divorce because that's going to make someone that's been divorced feel bad if we say that that's not God's desire for their life. So, okay, let's not talk about that too much. And yeah, we know that sex outside of marriage and adultery, that's wrong. But we talk about that, it makes people feel bad about their divorce, and then they think, so, okay, we're still going to acknowledge that it's wrong. We're just not going to talk about it a whole lot. And then all of a sudden, we get into the 90s and the 2000s, and it's like, sex is really just about that feeling. And so, it's okay if like a man and a man get together and maybe they can get married. Does it really matter? It's like, well, no, I don't think that's the direction we were going in. But wait, we don't want to offend anybody. And so, yeah, I'm uncomfortable with, equating marriage between a man and a man that being the same as man and a woman. So, is there something that we can do to, kind of separate that out? And we were assured, no. All we're doing is just making it where all people are the same. And we're not indiscriminately giving benefits to a married couple that's a man and a woman versus this. That's all it is. And so the church says, well, yeah, it kind of feels weird, but man, if I say that, there's about half of the congregation is going to get up and leave, and then they're not going to give next week. So I better not. Let's just talk about. We still believe that it's sinful, but gosh, we got to be nice. We got to be nice. So time just continues to go on, and shockingly, it wasn't enough just to be able to be married. No, now you have to affirm. You have to believe that is just as good and is the same as marriage between a man and a woman. And in fact, if you don't believe that, we're going to sue you until it gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And in fact, we're going to start introducing legislation that's going to say if you as a church don't affirm this, that we're going to take away your tax-exempt status. Right? All of this stuff is happening. It's not fully there, but it is happening. And then we see it devolve even more. Well, if it's okay for a man to sleep with a man, why isn't it okay for a man just to become a woman? And most people go, wait, we need to love those people, but there's something wrong. We need to help them. They are enslaved by sin. And so for us to just affirm what they're doing is basically us saying, you know what? Stay in the slave camp. But if we say there's something wrong with that, their feelings might get hurt. So you know what? It's just easier to let them stay in the slave camp. Right? So now, it's like, what's happening there? And then it's like, we say, well, if you're an adult, you can do that. If you want to choose to do that. Then all of a sudden, why are men dressed in clothes, in women's clothes, twerking in front of children at a library? That's weird. Where did that come from? Right? Can we stand up against this yet? The answer is no, because the spirit of the age says, no, that is what I want. I want to destroy the foundational principles of all of this. And this is how I'm doing it. I am slowly enslaving you all to sin. And that you start accepting sin as normal. And so you stay enslaved. That is the desire. And then it moves even further and darker. And this is obviously not everyone in these communities. But now it is true that there are millions of children throughout the world that are trafficked and used for sex slavery. That is true. And if you follow the logic that we've been going, it naturally leads there because there are no limits. There are no principles. There are no standards. So before I'd seen the movie Sound of Freedom, and I'm not going to put too much, movies are movies, right? But they can bring points, right? They influence culture. This is actually about an event that happened 5 years ago. No, not 5 years ago. It happened even earlier than that. The movie was made 5 years ago. The premise is they go and they end up saving over 50 children that were all had been in the sex slave industry. Right? And then this guy, Tim Ballard, actually starts his own black operations, and he has been doing it ever since. That's the premise of the story. Okay? He has been on Congress talking about this. There were lots of mainstream news articles about this event earlier in 2014, 15, praising it. This movie comes out. By the way, it was canned by Disney. Disney bought Fox, who had produced the movie. Disney shelved it for 5 years. Now it gets bought, it's distributed, it comes out. You would think we would be a society that could all come together on something. The evil of enslaving children. But yet there has been a lot of pushback against the movie. People saying, oh, this is just a conservative movie. This just feeds into the conservative conspiracy theories of all of this. By the same groups that were praising stuff like this less than 10 years ago. And because a guy who played Jesus 20 years ago is in the movie and shows some conservative values, and that now it's being produced by a company that at least says they have some Christian values, they can't even acknowledge that it is something that we should be watching as a people. That's a scary place to be. When for your political ideology, you're willing to say, you know what, it's okay that those children stay in the sex camps. That's a dangerous place to be. But that's where we are because that's how Satan works. And we have not been pushing back as a people against the work of Satan like we should. We got comfortable. And looking at evil is uncomfortable. But it is vital for us to understand the heart of God. The heart of God is to free people from slavery, both physical slavery. It breaks God's heart when he looks back at the 1700s, early 1800s of this country where we enslaved people. It was disgusting. And it's amazing whenever you think about, and I know this is a term you're not supposed to use, but those Negro spiritual songs that are so powerful. Why? Because they were sung while they were enslaved. Because they were not going to limit and be identified as slaves. They were going to be identified as children of God, even though they were enslaved on this earth. That's the heart of God. God wants us to find freedom in him, even when we experience the slavery of the world around us. And now, Satan is still at work, enslaving people, separating us into groups, pitting us against each other. That is what he is trying to do. But we serve a God who will not be enslaved. We serve a God who took on the penalty, all of the slavery that sin and death brings, and it shoved him in the tomb. And Satan rejoiced because he thought, if I can get rid of this, I can keep people enslaved to their sin, and there will be no hope. And he rejoiced on that Saturday. But Sunday came around, and Jesus Christ burst forth from the tomb. And he said, there are no more slaves in me. I am pushing that out There is only freedom. Get out of the slave camps. Run out of the grave. Live in the light of Christ. I don't care what your circumstances are. I don't care what your past has been. You are a new creation in Him. That is the message that we need to be speaking. But that is a message that is offensive to those who have chosen to live in slavery. But you know what? We can't just say, oh, well, just stay in your slavery. No, we continue to offer hope, and we make sure we live in that hope, and that we look at the world understanding it is trying to enslave us. Do not fall prey to that trap. Make sure that we continue to follow the one who has freed the slaves. That's the message that we need to spread. That's the message that we need to live in light of. Let's go to him in